told me that music has impacted him in so many ways. And if you ever want to witness a rousing, bombastic rendition of the Smashing Pumpkins hit Bullet with Butterfly Wings, even if a tad off-key, he is the man to do it. And he's also our president, and tonight he wants to give his thoughts on Steve Jobs. So please welcome Shane Kidwell.
It was in harmony. Some thoughts on Steve Jobs. As many of you, or frankly all of you probably know, Steve Jobs passed away on Thursday evening. He lived from 1955 and then passed away in 2011. And I know that, if you go to any of the Apple stores, they've got memorials to him, their flowers, their notes. I know he had a profound impact on everyone, but it feels to me that some of the impact seems to be focused on the products he made, on the iPad and the iPhone and the Mac computers and the various gadgets that we deploy, and it seems that that is what everyone wants to focus, that was his contribution. And I don't necessarily agree with him. I think there is something else about him that I identify with, that I found special, and I think others do too. And I think we miss the focus when we focus on these things that he came up with. Let me give you a little brief kind of outline of Steve Jobs' life. He was born in 1955, as I said before. He was actually adopted by a family, and then at the age of 13, Hewitt of Hewlett-Packard actually brought him in as an intern because Steve Jobs was asking him various questions and he saw promise in the guy, and so he brought him into the Hewlett-Packard company in 1968 to kind of learn a little bit more. In the age of 18, he went to Reed College, and he attended there for 6 months and decided he didn't like it very much, and so he dropped out and then kept attending, but he just attended the classes he wanted to attend. And he couldn't stay in the dorm rooms anymore, so he'd sleep for a year and a half. He did this. He'd sleep in all of his different friends' dorms, and he would sell, he'd recycle Coke bottles for the 5-cent recyclable Cokes to try to spend money on food, and then every week he'd walk 7 miles to the Hare Krishna temple to eat 1 square meal a week. He did this for a year and a half. In the meantime, he worked at Atari as an intern. And I don't know if any of y'all have heard of the game Breakout. It's a game that had a little paddle on the bottom, and you shoot up a ball, and you hit little bricks. Well, Steve Jobs invented that while he's at Atari. That was his version of taking Pong, one of the first video games ever, and making a single-player version of that. So that was Steve Jobs that invented that. And that wasn't enough, so he teamed up with his friend Steve Wozniak. In the garage of his parents' house, they developed the first commercially successful personal computer. And it was a big contraption that he mail-ordered and set up together. And it was the first one that anyone could sell that was commercially successful. And he ended up being worth about $200 million after this company succeeded. And then in his late 20s, he decided he didn't want to run a big company of 4,000 employees anymore. So he went out and found the very best CEO he could. And that CEO is John Sculley. He was running Pepsi Cola at that time. And he had the famous phrase of going up to John and saying, "Do you really want to sell sugared water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to change the world?" And John Sculley found that compelling and came on to run Apple as a CEO. Now the problem is that the next product that came out, it wasn't that successful, and Steve Jobs had created this fiefdom where they made the products and everybody else was lesser than them. And John Sculley's have a problem creating a corporate culture in that environment, and eventually convinced the board that we need to let Steve Jobs go. And they stripped him of any responsibilities, and eventually Steve Jobs had to leave. So as Steve Jobs put it, he was fired from the company that he founded. And he went on and started a company called Next Computers. Now Next Computers wasn't very successful commercially, but it is actually the first computer that was used to start the World Wide Web. The man who invented the World Wide Web used a Next Computer as the very first server. Also, he spent $10 million in buying the George Lucas Animation Studios and turned it into a company called Pixar, which you may have heard of, and that was actually Steve Jobs that started that company. He's the one responsible for Toy Story and Cars. This is the first computer animation films that had ever been produced and were commercially successful. He ended up selling it for about $7 billion to Disney. That made him rather wealthy, as if he needed more money. And then eventually Next Computers was bought by Apple, and they kicked out the CEO at the time and installed Steve Jobs after a year in place. And Steve Jobs came out with a fabulous computer called the Cube. And does everybody remember how brain-breaking? Well, some of you do. But it was this cube, and it didn't sell very well at all. In fact, it didn't go over. No one wanted it. So the key thing is that there's a bunch of things that Steve Jobs did right, but that's all we try to remember now. There's also a bunch of things he did wrong. And there are 3 lessons I want us to take from Steve Jobs' life. 1 is he overcame failure. 2, he held people to a higher standard. 3, he had the courage of conviction. And in terms of overcoming failure, he didn't just get rejected at birth from his birth parents. He was then actually rejected by his adopted parents. His first adopted parents didn't want him. They said, oh, we don't want a boy, we want a girl. They actually had to go to a second group of adopted parents before he could actually be adopted. So he was rejected right from birth. And then, as I said, everybody said, you can't build a $10,000 computer that did more than the personal computers. People wouldn't buy it. And you know what? They were right. They didn't buy it. And then they said some people won't buy a blocky computer that's a cube. And you know what? They were right too. The key thing, and this is the thing I want all of us to realize, we all have failures in life. But don't let those failures stop you. Continue to have the courage of your convictions. Continue to keep striving and keep believing what you believe. And I think that's what I take from Steve Jobs more than anything else, is the idea that he didn't believe in market research. Steve Jobs' market research and Apple's market research by extension was the right hemisphere of Steve Jobs' brain talking to the left hemisphere of Steve Jobs' brain, going, yes, I think they'll like it. And what he would say is that people don't really know what they want until they actually get to use it. And he was castigated for the iPhone, he was castigated for the iPad. People said there was crazy ideas, they wouldn't ever work. But the key thing, look, we're not going to remember these products 30 years from now. We're not. I mean, who thinks of the Walkman on a day-to-day basis now? I mean, no one. I don't. It's been surpassed by new technology. But the key thing Steve Jobs did is he believed in himself, and he built a company that was designed to have the courage of its convictions and the courage of its ideals. And all I want to say is that 1955-2011, Steve Jobs, that was one hell of a dash. Mr. Toastman.